So we are joined this evening by Isabella Rosner. Isabella is the curator at the Royal School of Needlework. She's also a research associate at Whitney Antiques and also the host of the So What podcast. Isabella is an art historian who studies material culture from the 17th through to the 19th century. She specializes in the study of early modern women's needlework, especially British examples and schoolgirl samplers across all time periods. Isabella is a 2023 BBC AHRC New Generation thinker and has just completed her PhD at King's College London, where she studied Quaker women's needle, shell, and waxwork before 1800. Isabella, I'm pleased to welcome you into the chat. I'm going to spotlight you now so that you should be big on everyone's screen. If anyone has any questions or having any tech troubles, pop it in the chat and I will help where I can. Okay, over to you, Isabella.
Thanks. Thank you, Laura, for that nice introduction. And thank you all for being here. I hope you can hear me. Okay, so I'm going to keep this very casual. I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I'm planning on saying in this thing and then just get straight into it. So as I share my screen, I'm going to talk at you. I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to the subject of embroidery and incarceration, how I came to write a lovely zine for Common Threads Press, and I'm going to kind of get you interested in some of the stories. I'm going to run through all 12 of the stories that are in the zine today, but I'm not going to have enough time to really get into the nitty-gritty of all of them. So we're going to keep it kind of introductory so you can buy a copy if you so choose. I feel really like a salesperson now. You don't have to buy a copy if you don't want to, but maybe you're going to be like, wow, this is so interesting. I need to know more. Hopefully you will. Okay, so earlier today, I was thinking, once again, trying to remember how I came to the topic of embroidery and incarceration, because since this was published a few months ago, a lot of people have asked me, and I feel like I can barely remember. And that is because I came to the topic during COVID, and I don't know about all of you, but I can remember basically nothing from that period. All I know is that in May of 2020, I started a podcast called So What, which was and still is about historical embroidery and those who made it. And one of my earliest episodes was about embroidery in various prison situations. It was a two-part episode. It talked about some of the objects that appear in this zine as well. And I think generally I came to the topic as a result of feeling a little trapped in the COVID lockdown and coming across embroidery that was made in times of strife, in times of trauma, and in specifically settings like prisons and mental health hospitals and workhouses, and feeling, to say a sense of kinship would be wrong because I very much had a lot of freedom available to me still, even in a COVID lockdown, but I was getting a better idea, I think, of what it meant to be stitching in some adverse circumstances. And it kind of came alongside thinking about just at the very beginning of my own reckoning with what I had known about embroidery history, which was a very kind of whitewashed, very romantic view of this thing of, oh, it's women, and leisure and free time and money. It's privileged people doing this in the home. I had done a lot of work already to think about how embroidery did not match that stereotype, but it wasn't really until thinking about incarcerated embroiderers as a group that I really came to terms with just how vast, how deep, and how radical the history of embroidery was. And while that came kind of to a head in 2020, I started learning about all of this stuff when I was in undergrad. I was lucky enough to take a class on collecting, and I learned at that time about Arthur Bispo do Rosario and Agnes Richter, both of whom appear in the zine. So it's been a long time coming. In July of 2022, I think, yes, maybe August, I sent Laura Moseley of Common Threads Press a DM on Twitter asking if she would be interested in a zine about embroidery and incarceration. They said yes, and here we are today. I don't really know what inspired that random direct message. I think I had been at the Victoria and Albert Museum that day and was feeling hyped that I saw a lot of embroidery, but I was also feeling like there were a lot of gaps in the narrative that that museum was telling, and I was hoping to get to be part of the conversation about broadening the history, the scholarship around embroidery of centuries past. Okay, and now that I've just rambled about that, let's get into it. So yes, that worked, right. So the zine has 12 chapters. I should say right here that the history of embroidery incarceration is vast. It covers a lot of centuries and a lot of countries and many different types of individual. There are only 12 stories in this book because it's a little guy, it's a thin little book. And I didn't feel like there was room for more, but hopefully maybe eventually there will be opportunities to talk about more of these stories because these 12 are just the tip of the iceberg. I chose these 12 because I thought they represented a wide variety of experiences through time and place, but there is so much more to learn about people who are embroidering in places like prisons or workhouses or psychiatric hospitals. So I start with Mary Queen of Scots, partially because she is the first kind of known example of somebody embroidering while incarcerated. Surely there were earlier examples of this, and she had contemporaries, but hers is the stuff that survives because she was a queen. I'm not going to talk very much about the history of Mary Queen of Scots right now, but what I will say is that she was imprisoned for 15 years by her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, and she was indeed in a prison setting. She was in a country house, and she was kind of chaperoned by members of the aristocracy. Her imprisonment was pretty relaxed in comparison to the imprisonments of the people we'll meet later in these stories. She had access to the finest materials, to good food. She had personal staff available to her. But of course, going from being a queen to losing all of her freedom and having all of her written communication surveyed meant that she did have a huge drastic change in circumstances. And in this, she took to embroidery. She had always been a passionate needleworker, but in her 15 years of imprisonment, she used embroidery as a way to kind of catalog and journal her personal everyday experiences, but also her emotions, how she was feeling about being imprisoned by her own cousin, the loss of power, the fear, the urgency. All of those feelings are very present. I chose Mary Queen of Scots first for this scene, not only because she is the earliest story, but also because I think she's a really helpful gateway through which we can understand, kind of shift our brains away from this stereotypical idea of what embroidery history is into the stories that are happening here. As I said earlier, I was used to the narrative that embroidery was for a very specific type of person, for typically a white woman of leisure, and that she did it in the domestic sphere. I was able to unlearn that and complicate that pretty early on in my studies of historic embroidery, but I realized that for most people in the world, and especially people who have never thought about embroidery or its history before, that is the image that comes to mind. And this idea of embroidery as an art form for the privileged few, I think, is perpetuated in things like magazine articles and newspaper articles that always have a title that says something like, "Not your grandma's cross stitch," or like, "Move over, Nana." I feel like I see that all the time still. And so Mary Queen of Scots is a good way for us to take this idea of it is a privileged white woman, she's a queen. She is matching this mold of what we expect an embroiderer of the past to be, but we're turning it on its head because yes, she was all of those things, but she was also imprisoned against her will. She was executed. This is kind of radicalizing and twisting this idea of embroidery being simply a pastime, an innocent, beautiful thing, and nothing deeper. So before I move on to the next story, I'm going to just show you briefly two images, and they're the ones that I talk about in the zine. This first one is a panel that Mary Queen of Scots made, and it says Jupiter up here, and it's a little dog. And I love it because this is her dog. She's giving us an indication of the richness of her life, the personal details that she was able to kind of surround herself with in this imprisonment situation. I think this is such a beautiful and tiny detail from, 450 years ago, that it's, when it comes down to it, it's a woman making a portrait of her dog. And I think that is incredibly charming. This is another piece by her. And I said earlier about embroidery being a way for her to kind of demonstrate her feelings about this power dynamic between her and her cousin Elizabeth. So here she has taken an image from a book that was printed just a few decades before, an emblem book by Conrad Gesner, and she takes this image of a cat, and that is what appears in the book. She labels it a cat, but it's C-A-T-T-E, and I love that. She has made the cat have ginger fur, just like her cousin Elizabeth, and she's added a crown to the cat. And she has added to the scene a mouse. And it's typically thought that what Mary is doing here is painting not only an innocent picture of a cat, but actually playing the game of cat and mouse, that her cousin Elizabeth is the powerful cat who taunts poor old innocent mouse, Mary Queen of Scots. Okay, moving on several centuries. And it's not to say, I should say here, that I'm moving from the 16th to the 19th centuries. And it's not that there was no incarceration embroidery happening in the 17th or 18th centuries. There was, and we know about it. It's just that I wanted to dedicate a fair bit of time and pages to the 19th century, because a lot of embroidery that fits within this theme of embroidery incarceration comes from a very specific time period within the 19th century, and I wanted to touch on that. So next comes Annie Parker. I was going to say love of my life, but that is not fair to her and probably not true. She's just somebody who I think about all the time and I'm really haunted by. So Annie Parker was a woman who unfortunately died at 38 years old. She was kind of a legend in what was at that time Kent, what is now Southeast London, in areas like Deptford and Greenwich. She, in her very short life, was arrested over 400 times for drunkenness, and she spent the majority of her life in prison. In 1 year alone, she spent 300 out of 365 days in prison. And while in prison, she embroidered, which is, already kind of substantial enough that she has been imprisoned so many times. But what is even more poignant and kind of striking is that she embroiders using her own hair. So this pincushion is not thread, it is Annie's hair. And we know this because she tells us in a lot of the objects that survive that she says Annie Parker wrought with her own hair. So you can't see it here, but in this second example, and this is very typical of her work, these kind of 5-part samplers, she will say at the end here, Annie Parker worked with her own hair. Annie Parker with her own hair. Over and over she says this. She doesn't say it here because she hasn't finished it maybe, or she just didn't write it. But for the most part, she is telling us that she is stitching it with her own hair. There is a lot to know about Annie Parker. I've done a deep dive on her, and I will actually continue to, because she fascinates me and I'm doing a lot of research on her. She had an incredibly hard life. What I don't get into in the zine is that she had a very abusive husband, and she actually gave birth to 4 children in prison, all of whom died in the prison. She was sensationalized in the press, and it was not only her experience as somebody who was completely a victim of her own addiction and a society that couldn't help her, it was also sensationalizing her hair and these objects she made, because she made these samplers and these pincushions for the people who were involved in the penal systems. So it was the chaplain, it was the person who ran the Greenwich workhouse. She was giving these things as gifts, and it's hard to know her motivation. It could be something as simple as, she is giving gifts in order to kind of garner favor, to avoid getting a felony count, to kind of lighten her sentences, or she is very grateful to these people for, trying to help her in this journey. It's really hard to say. And it's one of the great frustrations, but kind of motivators about that comes with studying embroidery, and Annie Parker specifically. We have so much of her. We have this knowledge of she's clearly a very gifted stitcher. She likely was, went to a charity school or an orphanage school because that's the style of stitching she's using. She was clearly very resourceful. She was dedicated. She was pious. We know this from the verses that she's including, but we don't know what she looked like. We don't know what her goals were. We don't know how she felt about this. We have a bit of her body, but we don't have any understanding of what she was experiencing as she stitched. And that absence is very present throughout embroidery history. And I think, just for me at least, makes me want so much to keep looking, to keep finding those feelings, and to investigate not only the archive, but the objects themselves, to see what stories they have to tell us about the people who made them. So a near contemporary of Annie Parker was Lorena Bulwer. Lorena Bulwer was a woman from Norfolk in England, and she was put into the Great Yarmouth Workhouse when she was 55 by her brother. She had been caring for both of her parents, and when her parents died, her brother was like, out you go. And while in the Great Yarmouth Workhouse, where she spent the rest of her life, she stitched. And she was kind of a machine. She stitched immense amounts of embroidery. So she has these, they call them samplers because, they're fabric with text on them, but they're scrolls, they're embroidered panels. And they're many, many feet long, 20 feet long, 20 feet long, 30 feet long, really very long, these panels that are covered in all caps text, all capitalized letters, no grammar. It's just like a stream of consciousness thing. And she, through these objects, is telling us about her life. And she is so mad. I say this in my zine. I talk about her anger because it is so present. She does not want to be in that workhouse. She wants you to know it. She wants you to know why she should not be in this workhouse. She is essentially providing us all of the receipts for why she shouldn't be here. She has a lot of angry things to say about her family members, about people within the Norfolk, like the kind of Great Yarmouth community, the Beccles community. She has a lot of stuff to say about a lot of people. And one of the things that I did not realize until I saw these objects in real life, and I am very grateful here to Ruth Battersby, who's the senior curator of textiles and costume at the Norwich Castle Museum and all of the Norfolk Museum's service. She pointed out that these objects are not just embroidered on a simple fabric, that they're actually embroidered on quilted fabric, which doubles, triples the amount of work Lorena Bulwer did here. She quilted the ground of the fabric that she was using, and then she stitched on top of it. There is an immense amount of work that has gone into this stuff. And the way it reads, you kind of feel like she's spiraling, she's kind of rolling, and she's doing this kind of stream of consciousness thing. But then you have to realize that she's doing this painstakingly slow art form to do this. She is spending so much time with every word because stitching is much, much slower than writing. And you can just feel very much this woman who is understandably stewing, who is in a situation she should not be in, that she feels that she should not be in. And she is trying to stitch her way free. She unfortunately never does that, but I'm very grateful that we have her embroidery that survives, so we can, it's a testament to her story. We can understand her and work to rediscover her and her circumstances because her embroidery survives. Another near contemporary of both Annie Parker and Lorena Bulwer is Agnes Richter. So while Annie Parker and Lorena Bulwer are in England, Agnes Richter is in Germany. Agnes Richter was a seamstress. She was German and had spent a few years in the US. And when she came back, she was very paranoid about money. And she gets put into a mental health hospital and then diagnosed with schizophrenia. While there, she embroiders upon a lot of her garments, but what survives is this jacket. And it is her uniform. She seems to have made it herself, and she has covered it with embroidery. You can't really see in this image because a lot of it is, the thread is like kind of the same color as the object itself, but this thing is wall to wall text. And it's so covered in text that a lot of it is really hard to read. It doesn't help that it's written in a kind of antiquated script called Deutsche Schrift. But the things that we can see are things like, I plunge headlong into disaster, which I think is a very poignant phrase. There are more simple things like brother freedom or no cherries or I wish to read, these little snippets of a woman's life. And what feels really important and important to me as I was telling the story, but important to bring up here as well, is that Agnes Richter was so desperate to stitch these words that she had a normal jacket and then she unpicked all of the seams and then re-sewed them inside out to give herself a secondary surface, another canvas upon which to work. It's why this jacket, you can see here, the front opening is pretty weird because like the arms are going backwards. That is because she has flipped everything so she can restitch more. And there's a lot to think about here with where this came from. So this was collected by a psychiatrist in the early 20th century named Prinzhorn, and it's in his collection. And this man, Prinzhorn, collected a lot of art from institutionalized individuals in Germany. And a lot of the art that is coming from women was embroidery. And it begs a lot of questions about, and this is not a question that comes with just Agnes Richter, but it's throughout this. What are the circumstances in which people are gaining these materials? Who amongst these makers are given materials because because the people who are running the institutions they find themselves in are thinking that embroidery is calming and restorative? Or who amongst these people are in places where people are concerned about needles? Like I occasionally, actually as part of the promotion of not only this event, but also the zine, I made a few TikToks about some of the people in the zine. And one of the first comments I got on all of the videos was, it's absolutely wild that somebody would be given a needle in a mental health hospital because that would never happen today. But it makes you wonder and think and want to investigate more the changing standards around art making in these spaces, but also about specifically embroidery. These sort of 19th century pieces came out of a time where women specifically were very much expected to be embroidering from their youth. Was this a simple extension of their non-incarcerated lives? Was there indeed this restorative rejuvenation thing happening? Was it thought to be a form of occupation? How did these people have access to needles and threads when they didn't have access to pen and paper? These are a lot of questions that I contended with as I wrote this zine, and oftentimes I did not have any answers. But maybe eventually we'll have answers. We'll find things in the archive. We'll be able to speak to each other and speak to people who have been in these circumstances and gain insight into how embroidery has changed in these spaces of incarceration. Big questions I'm realizing here. Here's a better photo, perhaps just a different photo of Agnes's jacket. And you can see the embroidery that's happening on the inside and the outside. It's double layered. And this feels, as does Lorena Bulwer's work, it feels like a diary. It feels like an insight into somebody's personal experience. All of these are so poignant, but the fact that she's wearing this, that you can see the fact that she has a physical deformity in her back through the way it's stitched. It feels very personal, very intimate. Next is the suffragette handkerchief, and more generally embroideries by the suffragettes, because the suffragettes were imprisoned frequently, and many of them in these spaces stitched. So they were embroidering things for each other. There was some gift exchange going on. And as we know from diaries and letters, there was also stitching with an eye toward their families keeping their embroidery as a way to remember their struggle, their strife, their fight for the vote. So there's a woman who writes to her children, hey, I've worked this thing so you can remember that I was a part of this, basically. She wrote it better than I just said it. But what comes out here is community building. Thus far, it's been a lot of personal embroidery and personal relationships with needle and thread, but here this is people coming together. So I should say that with a lot of these objects, and this is another good example, this is everybody is signing this, but it's one person embroidering it. It's Jamie Terrero is embroidering this, and this is in the Museum of London. But it's this coming together for a cause, and it's actually the remembering of this cause through embroidery. That's very rich when you consider that embroidery has for so long been women's work tied to femininity and womanhood, and that these women who are fighting to expand what womanhood means are using this art form that for so long was tied up with ideas of domesticity and submission and being quiet and pious and, you know, looking downwards, being in kind of internally focused. They're turning that on its head. And something I didn't talk about in the zine, but I want to bring up here is the unique moment these women are making this object. It makes a lot of sense that they are embroidering these objects because this is coming out of a time called autographomania, where in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, it was really popular to gather signatures, not only of your friends and family, but also of famous people in autograph kind of books, signature books. And there are quilts, there are tablecloth, there are loads of different versions of community building through stitch. And I just think these objects are really beautiful examples of people making active choices to turn the um, the the quote unquote submissive nature of embroidery around, while also buying into an art form that was convenient and worked well for the purpose of creating a united front for a cause. Okay, now we're moving on to we have moved with the suffragettes into the 20th century, and we're going to carry on with the 20th century, but we are going to move to the US right now. And this is an object called Ashley's sack. It is the only object that's not worked in a physical institution. These other objects were worked in places like prisons and mental health hospitals and workhouses. This is a symbol, an artifact from a very different type of incarceration, and that is enslavement. This is a rare example of slavery embroidery tied to the enslavement of so many millions of people in the United States and beyond. So this is a cotton bag. It's covered in darning spots and patches. It's very well used. And it's from about 1852. But in 1921, a woman named Ruth Middleton embroidered upon it. And I'm going to read the inscription to you because it's incredibly powerful and sad. My great-grandmother Rose, mother of Ashley, gave her this sack when she was sold at age 9 in South Carolina. It held a tattered dress, 3 handfuls of pecans, a braid of Rose's hair. Told her it be filled with my love always. She never saw her again. Ashley is my grandmother. Ruth Middleton, 1921. So this object was found at a flea market in the early 2000s, and it was given to a place called Middleton Place because the person who found it assumed that Ruth Middleton was tied to this place, which used to be a plantation. Turns out not to be the case, but that's how it ended up in a museum setting. What we're learning here through this inscription is that Ruth Middleton is the granddaughter of a woman named Ashley. Ashley, when she was 9 years old, was enslaved with her mother, Rose, and Ashley was sold away from her mother, Rose. And when they were separated, Rose gave to Ashley her most precious possessions. So it was a tattered dress, 3 handfuls of pecans, and a braid of Rose's hair. And the two were never reunited again. And it's so devastating. This object speaks for the many millions of people who are in similar circumstances, but whose objects don't survive. The fact that this survives at all is so very rare. Textiles, and specifically embroidery tied to American enslavement, exist. Those examples exist few and far between. This is an incredibly exciting and important survival. But what it tells us is the power of lineage. And really here specifically tells us the power of women, specifically here Black women, but it speaks to this theme that comes up not only in this zine, but in embroidery history generally, which is networks of women, women passing ideas and possessions and stitches and motifs to each other, teaching the young and the old laterally across the world. It's women. It was important to me in this zine to not include only women, but I would be remiss to not include this statement here that embroidery has historically not been only women, but has been primarily women for almost its entire history. There are moments in the history of embroidery where men and women are working side by side, and men are doing a specific thing in the world of embroidery more than women are. But women are really running this thing for centuries, for millennia, and it's something that we have to note. That's really important, that with these objects, we are able to understand or get glimpses into the stories of people who are very often not included in the archive. Women who are poor or middle class or like are in abject circumstances. They're people who are not frequently in the written record, but we get an understanding of who they are because of their surviving embroidery. Yeah, and this object, I think more than any other object in the zine, has the unique and difficult job of having to speak for millions of silenced people. It it is an object that holds those many, many stories in it, and that is kind of overwhelming to think about and to experience. Okay, next one. I think that actually probably some of you in this talk right now are here because of this object, because I made a TikTok about it a few days ago that went weirdly viral. But here we are. This is an object by a man named Major Alexis Castagli, or A.T. Castagli, and it is a sampler. It's made entirely out of cross stitch, and it looks, as I said in the TikTok, kind of normal. Like there's nothing immediately mind-blowing about it, although some people disagreed with me and said, oh, I know immediately here what the secret is. But basically, so we have a British man in a German prisoner of war camp. His name is Major Castagli, and he is teaching himself how to embroider. He already ran a textile company, so he kind of knew how to sew already. He takes a piece of linen given to him by another prisoner, and he pilfers a disintegrating jumper or sweater from a Greek general, and he unravels it to make thread. And he stitches a sampler that has in its middle this inscription that says, this work was done by Major A.T. Castagli, number 3311, while in captivity at Dosel-Lauerberg, Germany, December 1941. And it has around it the kind of national symbols of the players in World War II. And then it has people keep asking me what this object is. I don't know. I cannot tell what this symbol is. If you have ideas, please let me know. I do not know what that is. But the secret here, there's a code. And what that code is this border inside and outside is actually Morse code. A lot of people on this TikTok were like, I could tell immediately it was Morse code. And then the other half of people were like, I could never have guessed it was Morse code. Hard to say, to each their own. But basically what he has stitched here in Morse code is God Save the King, and pardon my French here, but he stitches fuck Hitler over and over again, these two sentiments. And I am delighted by that. What is amazing about all of this is his German captors did not see the Morse code, or if they did, they did not know it. And so they proudly hung this on display in 4 different prisoner of war camps, because Castagli was in 4 different prisoner of war camps between 1941 and 1945, and they never knew. And they actually were so like into it that they had him teach other people how to embroider using the Red Cross kits that were sold and included sewing materials. What is lovely and kind of hopeful in this sea of objects that are really not very hopeful is that Alexis Castagli was freed in 1945 and continued to embroider for the rest of his life. And he embroidered a lot while in the prisoner of war camps. He stitched letters to his children. He stitched objects that were covered in butterflies, the symbol of freedom. And he continued to embroider butterflies for the rest of his life. I think that is absolutely lovely. Yeah. What a nice, like, one lovely, wholesome, beautiful thing in a sea of generally devastating stories here. Speaking of code and speaking of World War II, I move on to the Changi quilts. And the Changi quilts, there are 3 of them. were quilts that were made by the women and children in the Changi prisons of Eastern Singapore. So this was another prisoner of war camp in World War II. And what happened was women and children were separated from men. And even though the camps were next to each other, there was no way for them to communicate about who was safe, who was doing poorly. Did you have that baby? What's the situation? So they came up with code to tell people, to tell the men that they were okay, or that, hey, you have a son now, or this person is sick. There's this communication system going here, and it's that every woman made a patch, and they are full of oftentimes very innocent looking symbols, but you'll get things like a blue bunny to represent that, you know, you had a baby boy. And this information was disseminated from these quilts via the hospital. So these were given to the hospital for recovering soldiers, and the soldiers that were recovering there were able to tell the other men in the prisoner of war camps that, hey, your wife is doing okay, you have a son, your kids are doing fine. It was this secret communication through images. So while Castagli sampler is essentially secret images through text, through dots and dashes, the Changi quilts are secret images told through pictures. Here's another one. There are three in Australia, US, and UK. Yes. And now the final World War II object. This is a handkerchief that was embroidered upon by a 19-year-old girl in Serbia. Her name was Rada Nikolic. And Rada was an anti-fascist in World War II, and she was arrested, and she was put in a camp, and she was sentenced to be killed. And while in the camp, she embroidered not only this, what seems to be a self-portrait and perhaps a portrait behind, behind bars, but she also embroidered the names of all the people that she was imprisoned with and their dates of execution, which is so devastating. I'm going to put this here because this is an amazing drawing of what you're actually seeing, because you can see here the pale blue blends in a lot, but this is what is actually written here. And the only person who doesn't have a date next to her name is Rada herself. So I'm actually taking my little zine out so I can read you what she says. And it's written in Serbo-Croatian. So I'm not going to read that. I'm going to read the English translation. She writes, as a memento to my dear mommy from her daughter, Rada. Greetings to mommy, Koka, Sava, Toma, July 20th. I keep thinking about you and waiting for them to take me out. Rada Nikolic B. Basta, born on August 28th, 1922. Arrested on January 1st, convicted and shot on January 24th. Greetings to all dear and beloved, your Rada, July 25th. Don't grieve, I'm not the only one. Many innocents have perished. I just want to apologize for right now for how extremely dark a lot of this craft and conversation thing is. But here again, we can't talk about embroidery and incarceration without talking about how devastating many of these stories are. This is a rare opportunity to see a self-portrait of somebody in incarceration. This is likely Rada herself. This object was indeed given to Rada's mother after Rada's execution and the end of World War II, and then she gave it to the museum in Serbia. But Rada is the youngest person we have in this story, and she is also the only one whose face we know through stitch. Another devastating object amidst many devastating objects. Okay, moving on. We're almost done because I'm also running out of time. This is the work of Arthur Bispo do Rosario. He was a Brazilian man who was institutionalized after having a vision that angels came down to him and said that he is God. And in his vision, he was tasked with replicating the universe in preparation for Judgment Day. And so when he was institutionalized and diagnosed with schizophrenia, he spent the rest of his life doing just that. He replicated the world in art and primarily in stitch. So he made about 1,000 pieces, and many of them involve embroidery. So this is considered his masterwork. This is his Annunciation garment that he would wear on the Judgment Day. And there are photos of him wearing it. It's big. You wouldn't expect it to be so big, but it reaches his knees. It is covered in symbols of everyday life. It's ping pong tables and bicycles and train tracks and boats. And on the inside is a list of the names of every woman he knows. Arthur Bispo Rosario's embroidery, because he is replicating the universe, it's incredibly encyclopedic. It reminds me a lot of Lorena Bulwer's work, not in terms of the same aim, but it looks similar. It's these all caps letters, objects covered in text. But for Bispo de Rosario, it's about commemorating everything he knows to be true about the world, everything he knows to be true about his experience. He has art pieces that are covered in boats and flags and military battles. And again, the names of people he knows, every name beginning with the letter A. It's an incredibly personal yet universal look at life through embroidery. And Arthur Bispo Rosario, speaking about the thing that I said earlier about these different circumstances in which people are embroidering, everybody was like, yes, please embroider. He was actually given a whole series of rooms that he turned into a gigantic studio. And he escaped the institution, the mental health hospital, for a few years, and then was brought back in. But during that time, he got away doing odd jobs and making art. This was something that he would have made, I feel confident he would have made whether he was in an institution or not. Whereas other artworks in this zine are people making embroidery that is specific to their circumstances. This is the embroidery of somebody who would have been cataloging the world when God told him to, whether or not he was in an institution. Okay. Two more, second to last one. This is Merlin. So this is an object called Merlin's coat. Merlin is the pseudonym of somebody whose name we do not know. And she was a Tennessee woman who was diagnosed with schizophrenia and institutionalized. And during her stay, her 5 years in the Tennessee State Hospital, I can't remember if that's the actual one, but she was institutionalized for 5 years. And during that time, she sewed a lot and she embroidered a lot as well. This is a horrible picture, and I'm sorry about that. But please trust me when I say that it is entirely covered in embroidery. It looks like the front is just plain. No, every single inch of this thing is covered in stitch. And the stitches here are these kind of buttonhole stitches to create circles. And it kind of feels like the cyclical circular thing that reminds me of Lorena Bulwer and her work, that she's rolling, she's on a roll, she is spiraling, and she is sharing that information with you. For Merlin, a lot of this is very personal, so some of it is gibberish. So the text oftentimes doesn't make sense. Some of the text, some of the images come from things like magazine ads or postcards, but some of the images are very personal. There's somebody who's getting sentenced in a courtroom. Is that Merlin herself? Perhaps there's a body falling through the air. Is that Merlin herself? Maybe. I would like to think yes, in terms of, I don't want her to be falling through the air, but I want a glimpse into her emotional landscape to understand what she was going through. What's incredibly sad about Merlin and her story is that she was given medication to calm her hallucinations and to calm her schizophrenia, but it ended up acting, as I say in the book, like a chemical straitjacket. And she got to the point where not only did she not stitch, but she couldn't remember that the stitching was her own. And I think that is a different sort of sad than we see in other parts of this zine. It's not about the institution taking away your agency. It's about medication and losing your own self in that process. And I think that's really sad, but an important thing to bring up in a conversation about embroidery and incarceration. Okay, last one, and then we are free to chat. This is the art of Ray Matterson. He is the only living artist in this zine, and Ray Matterson so basically in the 90s, he was imprisoned for robbery. And while in jail, he taught himself how to embroider. He was bored and he remembered his grandma's stitching, and he was like, that seems calming. That's like a nice way to pass the time. So he unraveled socks. There's a lot of the theme of unraveling in this zine is very present, and kind of remaking prison uniforms into pieces of cloth to embroider upon, that sort of thing. He unraveled socks. He took underwear as his fabric, and he created embroidery hoops out of kind of the big lid of a big plastic tub. And he taught himself how to embroider. He started embroidering things like patches with sports logos on them, like team mascots, so he could trade his fellow prisoners for things like coffee and cigarettes. But then eventually he started making more kind of pictorial pieces, images of his past life and where he wants to be and all of this stuff. And they're all very, very small. These are just a few inches big, and they have thousands of stitches per inch. And the reason I end with Ray Matterson is not only is he the most contemporary person in this zine, but he offers, again, another really necessary glimpse of hope and of freedom here. This is a series of stories where people are dealing with the loss of freedom in a whole myriad of ways. But this is a man who actually gains his freedom. He leaves prison, and he is to this day an embroidery artist. That is his career. And I think that's a beautiful thing to end a series of stories about embroidery and imprisonment with somebody who discovered this thing in that institution and then leaves the institution and continues to carry on with it. I just think that is a beautiful, hopeful note to end on, that to be institutionalized, and this is easier said than done as somebody who is not not institutionalized right now, but to be in these sorts of places is not to be exclusively stories of devastation and loss. It's also an opportunity for us and for those people to experience a sense of control, a way to pass the time, a way to calm the brain, a way to experience anger, stabbing a piece of fabric with a needle 1,000 times, a way to express emotions. Embroidery is everything, not to be dramatic or sweeping, but it captures all of the emotions in all of the circumstances. And I think that to have this hopeful story in a series of really not hopeful stories shows that it can do both. It can do everything. That embroidery has the capacity to reflect the entirety of the human experience. And now that I've ended on an extremely dramatic and sweeping note, maybe I'll stop. Thanks. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Oh, I think you're muted.
I am, however many
Back.
years
Hey.
later, using Zoom. So I'll just spotlight us both so we can chat. So thank you so much, Isabella. That was brilliant. It's always a pleasure to hear these stories again. Every time I hear you talk about it, it reminds me of how incredibly important your research is.
Thanks. That's so
And I
nice.
think
I'm nodding emphatically, not because I think my research is important, but because I'm like, embroidery history
no,
research is
you can
important.
nod at yourself being great. That's allowed. So yes, Isabella just took us on kind of a speed track through each of the stories. And if you would like to learn more about each of these stories, you can in the book, which I've put a link to in the chat. I would love for this to open up and to have some questions. So if you've got a question, please put it in the chat and I will go through. And whilst you're thinking of them, I'll just ask one of my own to Isabella. And I think so something that's kind of occurred to me whilst I've been working with you, editing this, publishing it, marketing it, is some people, saying, "Oh, this is like such a niche topic." And I actually, as time has gone on and I've learned more about it and heard you speak more about it, I've actually feel like this is actually an incredibly vast topic and it's not a
Huge.
niche small subject. And I think that's really clear why the way hearing you talk about them is how incredibly different, not just that how the works look figuratively, but how the reasons that they were created. As you were saying, some of them were done out of kind of this idea of wanting to kind of memorialize and kind of perpetuate their rage. And for some of them, it was a way to calm themselves down. Some of them, it's a way to create a kind of historical narrative about what's happened to them and is happening to others in Stitch. So I'm starting to think, that actually this is a topic that, each of these individual people are their own topic within embroidery and incarceration. And I'm guessing by you nodding that you agree that this is something that, there is actually sub concepts and themes within the broader concept of this scene.
Fully agreed. I think that the only thing that brings all these people together is the kind of institutions they find themselves in. Like, other than that, their circumstances are so different. There's very little that unifies them. And I should say that the list, I have like a note on my computer of stories of embroidery and incarceration that I did not include in the zine. And it I'm adding something to that list once every 2 weeks.
Mm.
Um, and it's just that some of them I did not know about before. Like I don't know how I came across Rada Nikolic, but as somebody who does not come from that part of the world, I had not a lot of contact with that sort of piece, and most of the information is written in Serbo-Croatian. Um, my awareness of the people who are doing this art across time is expanding all the time, and I am very grateful to all sorts of people who come into like my Instagram DMs or send me their master's theses who have written about the people who have done this in their specific countries. It's a massive world. And like earlier today, I was hanging out with my fiance's grandmother, who there's a reason I bring this up. She read this, which was very nice of her. And she said to me, I have never thought about, she's a tapestry, but like I'll take it. I've never thought about tapestry as being anything important at all. And I said to her, that is not surprising at all to me. I think that's how basically everybody feels. And it's because it's everywhere. It's We are surrounded by textiles, but also by embroidery, by needlework. So it makes sense that most people have never given it a second thought. But I feel like this idea of it being everywhere is matched by the huge variety of people who are embroidering and while incarcerated. It's Everybody's experience of embroidery is different. Everybody who embroiders in a different way, and everybody who embroiders while incarcerated is doing it for different reasons in different circumstances. And I feel like they are largely only united in their art making and the institutions they find themselves. There are themes that come up again and again, but like, yeah,
Yeah, and I think
it's
it
a
also kind of
mishmash.
it's a good thing that we have such diverse histories of embroidery and incarceration to reflect on. But I also think it speaks to quite a sad point, which is the international nature and the incredibly diverse different ways that the prison industrial complex has manifested in different cultures. Kind of makes you think that, they're all experiencing these similar things, and the world has created so many different ways for someone to have this feeling of imprisonment. Um, so yeah,
Yeah,
it's kind of bittersweet, isn't it?
it
Uh,
is so dark that it's a win for embroidery, but a huge loss for like everything else, including all of humanity, that everybody is reaching, everybody has to reach a similar conclusion across the world. That like my friend was in Vietnam a few weeks ago and sent me photos of embroidery that was made by female prisoners in a museum that I didn't even know about. But I feel like there are examples of this from every country probably in the world.
yeah.
Um, and that is bad.
But
Like
it speaks
cool
to
for
the
the study.
importance of remembering these histories. I think it reinforces that we need to do something to counter, this horrible perpetuation of incarceration, and find a way to remember these people and celebrate what they've created. Anyway, this is not a Q&A between
So
us.
true.
Um,
No, I
so
like it though. Hey, everybody.
question,
Sorry.
question from Stacey. Stacey asks, have you viewed any of these pieces in person? How does your experience of the piece deepen when you can see or touch it in person versus photographs?
Thank you for that great question. I did not talk about it in this presentation, so thanks for asking. Yes, I have seen, I'm going to actually just remind myself of the number of which ones I've seen here, because I'm going to take you on a journey with me. Okay. So I've seen Mary Queen of Scots, some but not all of her pieces. I have seen some but not all of Annie Parker. Annie Parker's pieces are all over the place, but I have seen a few. I have seen Lorena Bulwer. I have not seen Agnes Richter. I have seen the Suffragettes. I have not seen Ashley Sack. I have not seen the Castagli sampler, and nobody sees the Castagli sampler because it's in family hands. I've not seen the Changi quilts. I've not seen the Rada Nikolic handkerchief. I have really mad I've never seen Arthur Bispo de Rosario's pieces because they're always on in New York when I'm not there. I've not seen Merlin, but shout out, can I just say right now, because I'm pretty sure Julia is in this chat right now. The Merlin's coat is currently on display at the Museum of American Folk Art Museum in New York City in their new exhibition. I tried so hard to get a ticket to see if I could spend the money to go to New York to see it. I cannot, but please, I ask if you are in the New York area, please go see it. Please send me a photo. It's like never outside of Tennessee. That is so exciting. So I haven't seen it, but you could. I have seen Ray Matterson. Oh, Rat Matterson. Okay, so I've seen about half. And the this is how I feel about not only these objects, but embroidery generally when I see it, is I feel like a photo is helpful, but you do not comprehend the amount of labor that goes into something until you see it in real life. You cannot get the layering of that work. So like for Lorena Bulwer, I've seen those objects in pictures like way more times before I'd seen them in person, but I didn't even know about the quilting because I'd never seen it in pictures, but it adds an actual physical layer of labor to this that Ray Matterson's pieces are so small, you cannot comprehend how small they are. And that the stitches, there are just so many of them. So I think that it's, for me, seeing the embroidery in real life does make me feel closer to the maker because you can really see their hand and you can see the texture. But it's the thing that kind of the thing that kind of leads to all of my other thoughts about the difference between seeing the object and seeing a photo of the object is just the immensity of labor that is present when you see an object in real life. And also thank you to Julia for shouting out the exhibition. I will say for everybody, the exhibition is at the American Folk Art Museum in New York. And their exhibition is on the Art Brut movement. I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm sorry, I'm terrible at French, but it's a lot of the art that's on display is needlecraft, and as well as painting and drawing and stuff. But there are several big, heavy hitting pieces of embroidery that are on display right now in New York. Okay, that's it. I'm done now. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm muted again.
No problem.
Amateur hour. So, just first off, grateful for the people internationally who are joining this at Unsociable Hours.
Yeah, thank
You are
you.
greatly appreciated. And if you have to miss any of this, it will be recorded and sent round afterwards. So another question from Sarah. I've been fascinated with stitching and incarceration since 2010 when I saw the HMP Wandsworth quilt at the V&A Quilts exhibition. I've since taught prisoners myself, and I now volunteer and support an ex-prisoner through the charity Find Cell Work. Shout out to Find Cell Work, doing incredible
Shout out
things.
Find Cell Work.
Sarah asked, have you ever taught in prisons, or is it something you would ever consider?
I have not, and I definitely would. I'm actually going for the first time, can you believe it? I'm going to Find Cell Work next month to chat to them, to see the work in person. So I've been like a fangirl for a good long time.
Yeah, same.
Glad it's not just me. So I like know quite a lot of people who are involved in Find Cell Work in various capacities, because some people who are involved in the Royal School of Needlework are also involved in Find Cell Work. I'm very excited to get to talk to them. I am down to teach in prisons. I think I could be wrong, but I can imagine that a sense of belonging and a sense of lineage would be a very important thing to teach, especially prisoners who are making needlework. And I say that only as somebody who herself stitches, that for me, one of the most wonderful things about embroidery is that I'm not embroidering in a vacuum, that I'm doing the same thing that people have done for thousands of years. And I think that's wonderful. And I would like to think that people who are in various incarceration situations would be inspired by the fact that they also are not doing this alone, and that they are also not doing this in a vacuum, that they're part of a much larger artistic community. But yeah, keen. And I'm going on the 30th of May, and I cannot wait.
Unity asks, were there any common themes amongst those who self-identified in their work and those who chose to remain anonymous?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Okay, so I should say that I'm pretty sure, I think, yeah, all of my objects in this story this zine are tied to specific people. And it's difficult to find anonymous objects because there's so much space for interpreting or misinterpreting their stories and their connections. And oftentimes, so like my boss at Whitney Antiques has this amazing sampler that is very much it was made in a mental health hospital. It's like a kind of last will thing, but it's anonymous. And there are loads of kind of embroideries and pieces of lace at the American Visionary Art Museum in Baltimore that are also anonymous. And I think that this is painting with too broad a brush, but it oftentimes with people who are self-identifying, who are, and I want to make sure that I'm interpreting this correctly, right? Like adding their signatures and stuff like that, they are talking about themselves. These people are frequently talking about their stories. It is their life before or during or, this incarceration. It's oftentimes people trying to write about themselves as a way of getting out. So that's Lorena Bulwer, but it's also Mary Frances Heaton, who I don't talk about in the zine. Whereas the anonymous pieces, like the pieces in Baltimore, they are actually as specific. They speak just as much to an individual human experience, but we don't know who the individual is. So the themes, I actually think that the themes remain the same. It's just that we have to do different work on our end as the people who study the thing. So it's themes in this zine, you can see they run kind of by chance through this zine only because lots of people are working with unraveling socks or being angry or stitching freedoms of symbols of freedom. But I think what Laura was saying earlier about the fact that they're all so dispersed and diverse means that themes across everybody who's self-identifying aren't happening as much. And if they are happening, they're happening just as much as people who are anonymous. It's just that we can't link the anonymous pieces to a person, and therefore there are some missing puzzle pieces. That was a real ramble. I am sorry about that. Also,
Don't
yes,
apologize.
thank you. Also,
Thank
shout
you.
out to Claire Hunter's Threads of Life, and also shout out to Claire Hunter's what is it called? Oh
Embroidering
God,
her
Speaking Her
truth.
Truth, Embroidering Her Truth. I was like, what? Which is about Mary Queen of Scots. Yeah, I think Claire Hunter does an amazing job of stitching together, hey, stories of embroidery from all over the world and tying it to her own personal experience. Shout
Agreed.
out.
I keep getting Claire Hunter books for Christmas and birthdays. So I have
I love that for
a
you.
couple of copies of some of them, which is great because it means that my family are getting the right message of my
That's right.
interest.
They know you. They
Yeah.
know you deeply. Love
We're
it.
talking about embroidery too much. A question from Jill. Are there any particular
Yeah.
periods of time you'd like to find embroidery from?
So it depends on if you're talking incarceration embroidery or regular embroidery, but I'm going to answer both for fun. Okay, incarceration embroidery. I want, okay, this is this is my white whale, my holy grail. I unfortunately will never find it, and you will never expect the answer I'm about to say. Basically, according to these early 20th century issues of the Journal of the Friends Historical Society, which is a Quaker journal, there was a series of samplers made in York prison by Quakers in the early years of Quakerism. So like mid 17th century, these prisoners were embroidering and making samplers. Those objects, I'm so devastated about this. Those objects existed as of like 1912. And now they're gone, or now there's no information about where those live, because it seems to be that the trend of, sorry, this is my other area of interest, the Quakers. It seems to be that in the early years of the 20th century, the Quaker headquarters, Devonshire House, was kind of like handing out needlework willy-nilly, like lending it to people and like not super expecting it back.
Oh my God.
Yeah, there are like quite a few examples of things that go out and are talked about and then just never return. And I am genuinely very scared. And I'm pretty sure this is the case, that those samplers are some of those. And I feel really bad about it. So I would say that that's my number one white whale, holy grail period of embroidery I want incarceration wise. Like I combine my two interests, 17th century Quaker prison embroidery, because they were always in prison. So yes, they were stitching, we know. I would like to find it. Non incarceration embroidery. I'm going to tell you a little story. It didn't happen to me, but it happened to a person I know. And this is what I would like for myself. You guys are getting a unique insight into my brain now. Okay. So, Lynn Bassett-Zajac, who's an amazing textile historian, told me a story on my podcast a few years ago about how she went to the Goodwill bins for the non-Americans in the space. Goodwill is a charity shop, a thrift store. And if something at the Goodwill has not been sold for a specific amount of time, for like a long time, it goes to the bins. The bins are gigantic rooms where there are like bins, like literal dumpsters full of objects, clothes, furnishings, textiles that were never sold in the Goodwill. She went to the Goodwill bins in Boston, Massachusetts, and found a 16th century pincushion top.
How does that
Um,
even happen?
Great question. It's now in the MFA Boston. Um,
That's crazy that it wasn't even just in the Goodwill, it was in the bins from the Goodwill.
it's right that enough people for like a year were like, thanks, not for me. That they end up in the bill in the bins. And I should say, one fast fact about the bins is, as of at least, like, I haven't been to the bins in like 10 years. It's been a long time, but as of 10 years ago, at least in the Los Angeles Goodwill bins, you could buy one physical weight pound of clothing for $1. So Lynn probably bought this 16th century pincushion top for like 5 cents. Anyway,
Anyway.
Jill, you could not have expected those answers, but there you are, a unique insight into my mind.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Isabella.
A
Do we
pleasure.
have any last questions before we wrap up for the evening? Isabella, you've had a couple of people suggest things, tell you about things in the chat, so I'll make
Yes, I
sure to
saw.
save the
Thank
chat so
you.
that you can check those references.
Thank you
Um,
specifically also to Anna Maria, because I did put Anna Lapalainen in my list of people, and I have credited you, so thank you very much. Thank you
Lovely.
all.
Okay.
Yeah, such good stuff.
So I'm just going to stop recording now.